A real casual reading of the creation of humans can sometimes show us that we might actually draw some pretty simplistic conclusions here. For example, since the man was created first, he could appear to be the primary focus of God's plan for creating humans. The woman might seem to be an afterthought and created just for the purpose of giving the man companionship and comfort. Biblical scholarship, however, and some thoughtful reading really show the women's equality and partnership with the man. This passage shows us that God intended man and woman to live in cooperation. They are meant to share their life with one another. This text asserts that the two become one flesh. And that Genesis reading forms the backdrop of our gospel passage today. The question that's posed by the Pharisees, it was not if divorce was allowed, but it was when is it permissible. The question of divorce was long debated among the religious teachers. And Mark tells us that they were testing him. It does not take a biblical scholar to realize how vulnerable the wife would be to that of her husband. What was the something objectionable that would be grounds for divorce? A burnt meal? Not bearing a son? Old age? That was the focus of those debates. In Jesus' time and culture, a good and permanent marriage was crucial for a woman who could not own property and had no way of earning a living on their own. So a married woman had support both for herself and her children. It isn't hard to imagine how society could be affected by such easy divorce procedures. Consider the dire straits of a divorced woman would undergo in Jesus' world. For the most part, women didn't own any property. Marriage would provide them and their children the support and protection that they needed. On their own, they would be hard-pressed to find life's essentials. So you see, the law was crucial for the protection of women and their children from the more powerful forces that were aligned against them. Jesus' stricter interpretation of the law provided protection for women and children from the whims of the dominant and the strong. It was characteristic of his desire to protect the least in his society. Jesus always does that. In Jesus' time, the first century, the most vulnerable, the least protected were women, children, and foreigners. In the United States, in October 2018, the most vulnerable, the least protected are women, children, and foreigners. These readings today are not necessarily about the prohibition of divorce. These passages are about how Jesus, as he always did, seeks to protect those excluded who don't have societal recourse. Jesus responds to the Pharisees' question as a good Jewish rabbi that he is, by asking another question. What did Moses command you, he asks. Well, Moses, it was well known, permitted divorce with a certificate from the husband, which in the time of Moses was actually a way to protect the wife from total abandonment in their male-dominated society. With the certificate, women were free to marry again and have the legal support that she needed. Jesus refers to Genesis to show God's original intention, the equality of men and women. Adam found that the animals that God originally presented to him were inferior. And when God presents the woman to Adam and he finally finds one like himself, then bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. Even though today our country allows women to own property and receive wages and seek divorce, women and children and foreigners are still the most vulnerable. Women still earn on average 20% less than men for doing exactly the same work. Society still fails to fully enforce adequate child support, yielding an increase of those on the poverty rolls be made up primarily of young mothers and children. And foreign children, toddlers, are moved in the dead of night from cages to makeshift tents at our southern borders. And in light of our ongoing crisis of clergy abuse of children and our obligations to protect those vulnerable members, Jesus' words to us are overwhelming. Jesus preaches with urgency the coming of God's kingdom, which will enable a whole new way of living. Jesus' rebuke of the behavior of his disciples and his instructions to them about proper behavior towards the least challenge and empower all of us who claim to be disciples. Not to wait and see, but to actively do what we can do now to move us out of the situation that we find ourselves. These scripture readings present the vision of a whole new way of acting and being. Whether we are married or divorced or single or vowed celibates, we all know how far we are from fully embracing Jesus' vision of the new life. We struggle to live the gospel ideal in all walks of life, and we fall short. But we do not give up that ideal. We are here today at this Eucharist to have our hearts turned more fully to our God, whose heart is always open and totally turned towards us. We hope that today is another step on our journey to be faithful, not only to those to whom we've made vows, but to all that we are called to serve. We look for more faithful hearts in our service to others. All of us want our loving ways to reflect God's permanent and life-giving love for all of humanity. And if our hearts fall into the category which Jesus calls the hardness of hearts, then we have to beg the Eucharist to do the work of making our hearts more pliable to God's ways.